So thank you, Daniel, for reading that passage. And we're going through a sermon series called Love Your Church, which is really, what does it mean to be church? What should the church look like? What are the qualities of the church? And so for those of you who are a part of Barton, this is a sort of an invitation to reflect and think about what it means to be a church. For those of you who are just visiting, you can sort of hold us accountable to this and say, well, do they do what they say they should as a church? So, thank you for coming. And today we are looking at being a caring church. Now, the thing about this series, we've looked at belonging, church as an idea of belonging. We looked at welcoming, what it means to be a welcoming church. We've looked at what it means to be the gathered church, gathering together. And today we're thinking about being a caring church. And the problem I've found with preparing sermons and on a series like this is it can feel almost like, this is just a list of stuff we should be doing, more stuff. Like, if your life isn't busy enough, if you haven't got enough stress in your life, come to church and we'll give you more things to do and more stress and things like that. But I think for most of us, that's not really what we feel about church. That's not our experience of church. I mean, there are moments of stress, of course, but we keep coming because there's something else about church. Today, we're talking about being a caring church. Church being a place where people are looked after. Belonging to a church we should have an expectation that you get the blessing of being cared for by others if you're part of a church. That should be an expectation we have. As far as possible, Paul says in this passage, he says, as far as possible, do good to all people, especially to the family of believers. Being part of a church means you should be part of a group of people who are looking for opportunities to do good things in your life. That's what being part of a church means. And I think for a lot of us, that is our experience of church. We've had people around us who have looked for opportunities to do good things for us, to bless us. Ruth and I, over the years, sort of as a couple and before we were married, have been part of churches that have done good things for us. Many of you will, like us, have had furniture provided when you need it. Over the years, Ruth and I have had, I think, at least 2 pianos given to us, haven't we? Yeah, at least 2 pianos just given to us. We've had people lend us cars when we've needed it. We've had people give gifts of all kinds of things, meals, kindness, and care. And for a lot of people, this is their experience of what it means to be part of a church, to have people care for them. And I want us for a moment, as we start this sermon, to just realise and understand that for most people, that's not normal. That is not normal for most of the people in this country. For most people in this country, if they might have family who live nearby who can help them out, but a lot of the time, sort of people are on their own. If they can't cook a meal for whatever reason, well, they have to, get phone delivery or whatever, or they have to buy a takeaway. If they can't get to a place or another place, again, you're paying money, you're getting a taxi, you're calling Uber or whatever it is. If you need someone to watch your children at short notice, you're kind of stuck. Again, you have to pay for childcare or something like that. That's what most people have to think about, have to account for in their lives, but not the children of God. Not Christians. That's not what we do. Being cared for should be our normal. It should be our normal. And I would go so far as to say that you can be a group of people who get together in Jesus' name, and you can do all kinds of things, and you can have all kinds of great plans and ideas to sort of bless and reach and help the community and the world around you. But if you're not looking for opportunities to bless one another, that is not church. Jesus himself stresses this in John chapter 13. It's his last meal before his death. He sits down with his disciples and he says lots of things to them about what life is about and what church should be about. And one of the things he says to them, some words he says to them for his disciples and for everyone who follows in their footsteps, which includes us, he says, John 13:35, he says, "This is how everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another. That's it. That's the mark of what it means to be a disciple of Jesus, to love one another. That's what marks us out as disciples of Jesus. That's what marks us out as the church. We should love one another. It's that simple. And Paul says the same thing in verse 2 here in the passage. He says, carry one another's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. So if we want to be a church, a community of people who want to do what Jesus said, want to sort of fulfill Jesus' commands, we just have to do one thing. Carry one another's burdens. That's it. That's all there is to it. That ticks all the boxes as far as what Christ commands of his followers. Simple. Very simple. But it's not easy, as I'm sure you're aware. And this is why Paul encourages the church. He says, don't become weary in doing good, because we can get weary in caring for people. It's tiring, it's hard work to care for others. There is a thing that they call compassion fatigue, that you get worn down by all the needs, by being asked to give and care about so many different things. You just kind of get worn out by it and stop caring and give up. And this is kind of what Paul warns the church in the Galatians against. He says, don't give in to compassion fatigue. Keep going, keep caring for one another, keep doing it, because if you do, when the time is right, there'll be a rich harvest if you keep going and don't give up. So in the passage we read, Paul kind of likens being church to sowing seeds. He says it's sort of a lot of life is like sowing seeds. Everything you do is like you're planting something. And in the future, there'll be consequences. There'll be a fruit. There'll be a harvest based on what you've planted. And Paul actually links in this passage to us caring for one another. He says, when we care for one another, we are sowing seeds. We're planting something, meaning that our actions when we care for one another should produce fruit. There should be consequences, good consequences in the future. This language of sowing and harvesting. In the church, we might easily link this to certain things. Like we might say, well, when I'm talking about Jesus with people who don't know Jesus, when I'm sharing my faith, I'm planting seeds. And there might be fruit in the future. Or you say, when I'm sort of in the Sunday teaching the children in church, or when you're doing something like this, you might think, well, I'm planting seeds and maybe there'll be fruit in the future. But Paul says, when you care for one another, you are planting seeds. When you just love one another, you are planting seeds that bear fruit in the future. By loving one another, by carrying one another's burdens, we're not just, being nice to one another. We're not just doing something good for another person. We are planting seeds that will grow and will bear fruit in the long term. And Paul says here, all of our actions, we're sowing seeds, and you can either sow to please the Spirit and you'll reap a harvest of eternal life, is what he says. But you can also sow, he says, to please the sinful nature, to please just yourself. And he says you will reap a fruit. There'll be fruit from that as well, but you're going to harvest destruction. You're going to harvest pain from that. Sometimes caring for one another, loving one another, doesn't just mean meeting practical needs. After all, there are lots of different burdens that we need help with carrying. Coming alongside one another in difficult times. Sometimes caring for one another means going to one another and saying, well, what are you planting at the moment? What seeds are you planting? Do you realise that in the future you're going to harvest a lot of pain from these actions, from these decisions you're making? I once witnessed one Christian go to another Christian and say, look, I've noticed that in sort of situations of stress and tension, you become quite agitated and sort of lash out at people around you. And the person who was told this, they were embarrassed and they were sort of annoyed that someone had said this to them, but they were mature enough to go away and think about what's said and say, yeah, actually, I think that person's right. And then they could take steps to changing the way they behave, to sowing a different kind of seed in their relationships. And Paul says, brothers, sisters, if any of you is caught in a sin, those of you who live by the Spirit should restore them gently. But watch how you do it, or you may fall into sin yourselves. This is part, I think, of what it means to care for one another as well. Peter talked about it last week in his sermon about the gathered church. He talked about the need to sometimes challenge one another. Paul here calls it restoring one another. Restoring one another. And he's very clear, you've got to do it the right way. Do it gently, or you yourself are going to be the one who is falling into sin. You see, when we sort of challenge one another or talk to one another, we can do it. We sow seeds that way too. We can do it to please the sinful nature. We can do it because we're annoyed with someone, or because we don't like someone, or it's just for selfish reasons, or to make someone feel bad. And if you do that, you'll reap a harvest of destruction. That's true as well. But if you do it properly, if you challenge one another so to please the Spirit, then actually we're caring for one another. We're planting something that will bear fruit in the long term. I don't know if you've ever had someone sort of challenge you over something in church. Did you feel like they were caring for you in that moment? Well, if they did it properly, they were. That's the way Paul understands it. I think the reality is that when we become part of a church, part of a Christian community, we give up some of our rights to a private life, to a life which is just mine and no one can tell me what to do or how I should live. Because to be part of a church is to invite people into your life. It's to share your life with others. And sometimes people, if they were wise, they will give us what we need rather than necessarily what we want. Sometimes we get caring for us and selfishness confused and mixed up, and we think they're the same thing. And really, what we're just asking for is for people to please our sinful nature, as Paul puts it, to just, sort of stroke our ego and make us feel better about ourselves. And part of that kind of attitude can say, well, I want the church to care for me. I want people around me to care for me, but on my terms. They can give to me, but only the things I want them to give to me, when I want them. And all kinds of things. Or we can say, well, I'll let the church care for my practical needs, but I won't let them into my life. I won't let people into my life. Those are just ways of sort of pleasing the sinful nature, just sort of making selfishness the motivation. Sometimes people think, or we think, we're only being cared for if we get what we want all the time. That's the only way we can be loved, is people give us what we want when we want it. And in a church, that can be quite difficult and messy and awkward and dangerous sometimes, because maybe you know people who've done this, or maybe you have been a person who's done this in the past, is you've become part of a church and you have a sort of list of expectations of what it means to be cared for. Like, this is how I will know I'm being cared for if they do this, this, and this. And when the church fails to meet those expectations, you walk away disappointed. And perhaps sometimes we're a bit too willing to let other people know how we've been let down by a church or how they haven't cared for us. There's a need, I think, when we're talking about caring for one another, there's a need to be self-aware about our expectations, about what our needs really are. What's really important. Paul, I think, in this passage talks about this as well. He references this idea, this need to be honest with ourselves here in this passage about caring for one another. There's sort of verses 3 to 5. It's quite interesting. Like verse 2, this stood out to me when I sort of read this passage over the years. In verse 2, Paul says, carry one another's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. And you think, yeah, that's great. And then immediately, verse 3, he suddenly says, right, if any of you think you're something when you're nothing, you deceive yourselves. It's like, well, calm down, Paul. Where did that come from? Like, he's just said how, it's really nice thought about carrying one another's burdens. And then he's immediately into, well, don't get ahead of yourself. Don't think too much of yourself. And he says, you've got to test your own sort of motives. You've got to carry your own load. That's kind of seems weird to me. There's almost a contradiction where he's just said, carry one another's burdens. And in verse 5, just a couple of sentences later, he's saying, everyone should carry their own load. Like, does that sound like a contradiction to you? It's kind of jars a bit with me. But I think Paul simply is kind of saying, he's saying, look, we need to carry one another's burdens, but don't take advantage of one another. Don't use that as an opportunity. Don't use people's love for you as an excuse to be selfish, to just sort of take. Be honest with yourselves about what you want and what you need and the difference between the two. Don't look around and compare yourselves with others and say, well, why are they getting that care and I'm not? Sort of, why, or, well, maybe I'm being a bit selfish, but at least I'm not as selfish as that person. At least I'm not as needy as that person. Paul says, no, that's not the way to do it. Again, whether we are giving to others or being given to, do not sow to please the sinful nature. Sow to please the Spirit. I think one of the traps we can fall into as a church is sometimes we can think that people in the church fall into one of two camps. Either, there are the people who are needy and need to be cared for, and there are the people who do all the caring, the strong ones, the competent ones. And we can sometimes think the church is a bit like that. But again, there's a thing here in this passage which I think exposes that as a bad way of thinking about what church is, about who we are as the people of God. Paul, in verse 6 here, he says, look, if any of you receive instruction in the word, you should share all good things with your instructor. And I'm not sure specifically what Paul has in mind. Maybe he has in mind a kind of a mentoring relationship. If any of you are being mentored or cared for, remember to share good things with someone who's mentoring you. Remember to encourage the person who's mentoring you. I think Paul has a bee in his bonnet about this one thing. He brings it up a few times. I think Paul's general attitude is we should be a blessing to one another. Be a blessing. If someone's giving something to you, if someone is blessing you, you be a blessing to them in return. Don't adopt this attitude of, well, I'm just, these people are givers and these people are takers and that's church, and maybe we're on, one day we're on one side of the fence and one day we're on the other side of the fence. Paul's attitude is, no, we're both at the same time, all the time. We are caring for one another and being cared for. When Paul, in his other writings, one of the things in the New Testament letters you'll see is Paul goes around, visits other churches, and he often stops. And there's a few churches where he writes to and he talks about, he's collecting money for the church in Jerusalem because the church in Jerusalem was going through a famine. And there was a great need there. And he writes to a few churches. He says, when I stop by, I'll collect the money that you've put aside to help with your brothers and sisters in Jerusalem. And when he's writing to the church in Rome, one of the things he says is, you should give to the church in Jerusalem that's really struggling at the moment. And he says, you who've received spiritual blessing from the Jews should give them a material blessing. They're struggling with a famine. You should help them out because you, through Christ, have received the blessing that came to them as the people of God. And again, it's this same idea that Paul has. This is why I say he's got a bee in his bonnet about it. He comes back to this idea of, you need to sort of bless one another. Don't just bless, even if you are receiving, you are still in an opportunity to do good to those who are giving to you, to encourage and bless those who are doing good things to you. We can all build one another up. We can all share good things with one another. And we can share with people who are blessing us. And it doesn't have to be something physical or material, because we may not be in a position to do that. I think one of the key reasons we become weary in doing good as Paul talks about, as Paul warns about, is because sometimes we care for others and it seems that we've achieved nothing. It seems nothing has happened. We've given of ourselves to another person and nothing seems to have happened. And we might know, well, like Paul says, we have to wait sometimes, it will bear fruit in the future. But it's hard work having to wait all the time for fruit, having to wait all the time for good things. I think all of us, we're like ships on an ocean. And sometimes, there's a strong wind that carries us along, and sometimes there's no wind and we have to get the oars out and row, and that's hard work. And it's hard work sort of being on the oars all the time. And sometimes that act of kindness, that act of encouragement, it just helps us. Every now and then we all need a little puff of wind in the sails to keep us going, so we can put the oars in for once. And I tell you, there are few things as encouraging and as helpful, few things that sort of put the wind back in your sails, as when you've done something for someone, you've tried to help someone, and they come back to you and say, you know what, thank you for what you did. Thank you for that. This is what it meant to me. Sometimes that's all they have to do. They don't have to do anything other than say, thank you, this is what it meant to me. Or someone come to you and say, a couple of weeks later and say, that thing you said to me, well, I've actually thought about it and thank you. It was really helpful. Here's how it helped me. Just there's an opportunity to do good to one another, just by encouraging and blessing one another. Because that helps us not to be a people who give up in doing good for one another. Because I think the church is not a group of people divided into, those who care and those who are cared for, those who do the caring and those who receive the caring. The church is the church. We are a group of people who, as far as possible, look to do good to all people, especially to each other.